a chaplain is a religious professional who specializes in administering care, or ministering, as the religious professionals sometimes use, ministering to those in spiritual distress. Most
Okay.
typically in a setting or a moment of heightened distress due to life and death situations, illness, crisis, natural disaster, danger, and so forth. So, in pop culture, the most famous chaplains of all time include the priest in MASH. So that is a chaplain in an army setting. There are hundreds, if not thousands, of chaplains employed by the various armed forces, and those are clergy people employed by the government. It's kind of a wacky bending of the rule about church and state, but the idea is to provide spiritual care for the troops. And yes, there are, reflecting the numbers and the need within our armed forces, there are chaplains who are trained in Catholic and Protestant versions of Christianity, as well as different versions of Judaism and Islam.
Okay.
There may even be a handful of other smaller religions within the military, like Sikh and Buddhist. I'm not sure, but it's possible. It should be said, though, that chaplains are trained to administer their services, or let's say provide. Administer is kind of wonky. To help people in their own faith tradition and across the faith tradition. So, for instance, I am in real life trained as a chaplain. I'm a real cantor. I went to cantorial school, which is a seminary program that was 5 years of Jewish music as well as Judaics. So I'm a real clergy person. And then I did 4 years of chaplaincy training while I was already a real cantor, wherein I visited for 1,000 hours of visitation with supervision. It was, I think it was several hundred each year times 4. That's how I get to 1,000 hours. But like visiting bedside 1 hour at a time. That was the training for chaplaincy. It's not super, that piece with the supervision and then like the roundtable discussions is similar, Artie, to how I understand a lot of social workers and school counselors get training, because you have these sort of clinical moments that are private, but how do you dissect them and reflect on them? So that in the chaplaincy training, we did what were called verbatims, 10 per year, where you would kind of account by memory a one-on-one encounter, write it down. You later, use pseudonyms or initials, so you're not breaking any confidentiality rules, and you write as many exchanges as you could remember, and then later you type it up and then analyze it. This sounds super daunting to the listener. It is very hard at first, and then with repetition, the exercise becomes easier. By the time I was in my 10th verbatim, the 4th year, I was like, oh, no problem. And I could do upwards of 30 exchanges by memory, no recording device. It's kind of a remark. And I'm not, my wife will tell you I have a pretty bad memory. So it was a particular kind of a skill. But the reason why we did it, and it's very particular to chaplaincy, is we were training in this kind of art of the brief and impactful helping encounter, where you go into the room. You're not promised a long visit. Depending on the health and energy of the person you visit, you might get between 20 and 40 minutes. More than that, you're kind of pushing it, and you might exhaust the person you're visiting. But in that time, you're trying to quickly establish rapport, make them feel comfortable. As you morph into what's going on, you try to quickly in your mind identify what's the source of spiritual distress.
Mm-hmm.
And if you don't want to make it religious, if you were just being a counselor, you would say, what's the problem? But spiritual distress is the phrase that chaplains use. because we kind of speak in religious metaphors. If the patient says, hey, I want a visitor, but I'm not interested in your religious mumbo jumbo, I'll be like, great, I'll sit with you and I can play the guitar. By the way, I have the guitar over my shoulder for those of you who are listening. I usually traveled room to room with a backpack guitar bag and a guitar in it. And after talking for a while, if the conversation stopped or if the person couldn't talk a lot because they were seriously ill, guitar and song could be a nice way to bring some life to the visit. But anyway, I hope I explained what chaplains are. Again, they can exist in a military setting, a hospital setting, a hospice setting, a prison setting. This is a fun fact. They're chaplains for many professional sports teams. They're chaplains for some NASCAR teams.
Interesting.
NASCAR has an unusual need in that once in a while a driver gets killed because of high-speed crashes. So a chaplain might be on hand to provide essentially crisis counseling in a sort of religious fashion. Yeah, it's good to know what a chaplain is to understand my play, because our hero, Rabbi David, is a chaplain, based loosely on my own experiences. And yes, he looks a lot like me when I play him on stage. But I am not Rabbi David. Rabbi David is not Ben Kintisch. But the character I play is a beginner chaplain. And that experience of being a beginner chaplain is something that has echoes from my own life. But I think like any theater goer might relate to the struggle of being a beginner and needing to do well at a job, trying earnestly and still stumbling repeatedly.